I finally found a vehicle that matches the colour of my water bottle. That's completely insignificant, but what isn't is the fact that the MG4 EV is the first C-segment fully electric vehicle from the Chinese automaker. Indeed, it's competing with the likes of the Cupra Born, VW ID3, Nissan Leaf, Renault Zoe, among a few others. And it's also the third installment in the EV range, whereby it comes in after the success of the ZS EV and the MG5 EV. Now, despite being the newest addition to the fleet, it's actually one of the cheapest. It comes in at £26,000 with the top spec trophy long range that we have on review coming in at just £31,500. If you want a detailed breakdown of the trim levels, do check out our written review down the description below or indeed in the pinned comments. So to kick off this review, let's talk about its electric range. And here the SE long range and also the Trophy long range, which we have on review, have a 64 kilowatt hour gross or 61.7 kilowatt hour battery pack. Now in our mixed driving test, we netted 220 to 240 miles, which is actually pretty impressive, specifically in the hatchback class. Let's just put it into perspective. It's better than the Renault Zoe and the Nissan Leaf Tecna E+, which both netted roughly 200 miles in our mixed driving test. Then in comparison to the Cupra Born, it's a little bit better than that as well, which netted roughly 210 to 230, while the VW ID3 got around 230 miles. Even putting in the Tesla, the entry-level Model 3 into the mix, we netted roughly 230 to 250 miles. So yes, the MG4 EV is actually seriously impressive in this department and actually makes it stand out in comparison to its all-electric hatchback alternatives. Now, it is worth considering, however, there are some electric SUVs, compact ones to be more specific, that actually give the MG4 EV a run for its money. Now, there is the ZS EV, which got around 230 to 250 miles, so marginally better. But then you've got the Kia Soul EV, the Kia e-Niro, and the Hyundai Kona Electric, all achieving north of 260 miles. And then let alone the Skoda Enyaq iV getting over 300 miles, and even the VW ID4 and ID5 with a heat pump, you can get over 320 miles. But that's a bit of a different class, but it's just worth considering that there's some other alternatives out there. Now, as for the entry-level SE MG4 EV, you should be netting roughly 160 to 190 miles. We haven't tested that, but we can only assume that you'll get similar sort of efficiency as we are getting in the long range model, and given the battery pack is smaller at around 51 kilowatt hours, it gives you a rough estimate as what you should expect from its electric range. Now, for you to be as efficient as possible and to recoup energy back into the battery pack, you have got regenerative braking. There are 4 different modes that you can select through the infotainment system: level 1, 2, 3 and adaptive modes. Here, the harshest out of the bunch, level 3, which is what we're currently in, is not quite harsh enough to give you to a complete standstill. So instead, over here I'm driving 10 miles an hour, I lift off and it's going to come to a crawling speed of around 4 to 5 miles an hour. Similar behavior like what you'd find on the VW ID3 or let's say the Cupra Born, but not quite the one pedal driving approach that you'd get on let's say the Tesla Model 3 or for example the Nissan Leaf. It's a shame that MG have not integrated a one pedal driving mode, given that the MG4 EV has been built from the ground up as a fully electric vehicle, and therefore having that option would have certainly been appreciated to make inner city commutes a little less cumbersome. Now, aside from this, a small little point that we'd like to make is that you can adjust the regenerative braking modes on the fly using a custom button on the right hand side of the steering wheel. It's the star icon. Now, that's very handy, but it's a shame that the drive modes are not preset to the regenerative braking modes. In other words, let's say we're in normal driving mode and we want it to be on level 3. Well, you have got that, but then if you go on sport mode, let's say you want it to be on level 1, well then you're going to have to faff around with the infotainment system if you've assigned that button to change between the drive modes. If you've assigned it to be the regenerative braking modes, then you're going to have to go through the infotainment system to select the different drive modes. Hopefully that makes sense, but anyway, a potential future firmware update from MG might be able to solve this, whereby you can actually link the regenerative braking modes with the drive modes, and that would make it, well, a lot more intuitive to use in different driving scenarios. Now, of course, if you do want to retain energy at a much more rapid rate, you can plug it in. And here on the long range models, you have got 135 kilowatts of input charge that's capable via the CCS port. Now, this means you can go from roughly 0 to 80% in 35 minutes, at least if you find a high-speed charger. If, however, you're capped to 50 kilowatts, it'll take you roughly 1 hour instead. Now, it is worth considering here that the MG4 EV has got a capped onboard charger at 7 kilowatts, whereas some of its competitors offer 11 or sometimes even 22 kilowatts, which means they've got benefit of 3-phase power supplies. Here, this means that the MG4 EV will go from 0 to 100% using a 7 kilowatt wall box charger in roughly 9 hours. So you'll definitely want to plug it in overnight if that's what you're going to be doing. Then you have, of course, got the 3-pin socket, but that's going to take you a whopping 26 hours instead. Now, the MG4 EV as standard also has got vehicle to load technology, and that means that via an adapter you should be able to plug in any sort of household appliances. It's got an output discharge of roughly 2.2 kilowatts. So with all of that in mind, what about when it comes to its performance? Well, here there is a rear mounted motor which dispatches 150 kilowatts of power. That equates to 201 horsepower and gives you 250 newton meters of readily available torque. Now, from 0 to 60 miles an hour, we had it tested using RaceLogic's V-Box Sport at 7.28 seconds, which isn't too shabby in the grand scheme of things and will still feel pretty punchy. Now, as for its top speed, no matter which trim level you're going for, it'll be capped at 100 miles an hour, which should suffice for most, but I do appreciate some German viewers out there will be like, oh, well, my old petrol and diesel vehicle could get me up to 150 miles an hour. And yes, that is very much the case, but unfortunately in the all-electric market and at this price point, you're going to be limited to roughly 100 miles an hour in terms of top speed, be it with the MG4 EV or any of its German or indeed alternative rivals. Now, on the subject of its German rivals, and here we're thinking of the VW ID.3 and the Cupra Born, and yes, I understand the Cupra is not quite German, but it's owned by the Volkswagen Group, so we're going to consider it German for the sake of this comparison. The MG4 EV also has a rear-wheel drive system, and therefore gives you a good level of fun, confidence and grip when you're on the road. Indeed, unlike the ZS EV or the MG5 EV, which opt for a front-wheel drive configuration, the MG4 EV just feels far better to drive and just really gives you that joie de vivre, as the French would say. Now, this is of course not to be confused with a vehicle that has perfect driving dynamics, such as the likes of, let's say, the Polestar 2 or the BMW i4, or even, let's say, in the hatchback class, where the Honda E and the Mini Electric really do shine in this department. But still, in the grander scheme of things, it is up there with some of the best, and one that will certainly bring a joy to a lot of people's faces. Better still, the suspension system has been tuned to perfection, at least in our opinion. See, it's not as stiff as the likes of the ZS EV, nor is it as soft as the MG5 EV, but rather is somewhat a mix between the two, and therefore means that when you're pottering in and around town, you're not going to feel like you're seesawing about on going over speed bumps, potholes, or indeed anomalies on the road. And equally, when you're going on windy country roads, you'll feel a good sense of connection with very minimal amount of body lean. Indeed, it's a pretty good system that they've integrated, but make no mistake, it's not going to compete with adaptive air suspension systems, although they do come in at a much more expensive price tag and in vehicles that do cost a pretty penny. But it's just worth considering in comparison to vehicles of its class and indeed its siblings, the ZS EV and the MG5 EV, the MG4 EV is our pick of the bunch. Now, what also constitutes in having a good driving experience is low cabin noise, and here the MG4 EV is actually pretty well insulated and also doesn't suffer from any sort of low-end resonance like you'd find on the ZS EV. In fact, if you want a detailed breakdown, do check out our audio review that can be found up on your pop banner, down in the description below, or indeed in the pinned comments. Now, this does bring us on to its audio system, and as standard you'll have 4 speakers, but in the trophy long range that we have on review you'll have 6 speakers with 3D sound. What we'll say in a nutshell is the latter system is actually pretty punchy and should suffice for most consumers. Now, this does lead us on to the use of technology within the cabin, and at the center of the dashboard you've got a 10.25-inch infotainment system. Now, this is very much useful for adjusting your climate controls because there is no physical climate controls, which is pretty a shame and somewhat baffling to see that why manufacturers are getting rid of such controls, but it is also pretty vivid and also intuitively laid out. However, it is very sluggish, and in comparison to rival offerings, it is very much lackluster in terms of its performance. Furthermore, we also experience a few software glitches, whereby Bluetooth seemed to counteract with Android Auto and pretty much lock us out of both systems, so much so that we actually had to perform a factory reset, which is very much something of a rarity when it comes to a press vehicle. Similarly over here, the 360-degree cameras seem to be only available on a one-time use. In other words, when you switch on the vehicle from a cold start, you'll have the 360-degree cameras, at least on the trophy long range, of course, where it is available, but then after that, they completely disappear, and there's no means of reaccessing them, be it if you're popping yourself in reverse or indeed pressing the app icon of 360. We hope that MG will address this in future firmware updates, and we've reached out to the manufacturer for comments, and if we get any sort of updates, we'll pop it down in the description below. Now, I did just reference one of the third-party mobile operating systems, and indeed Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are both supported over a wired format. It is a shame not to see wireless support. Now, for you to connect up to the infotainment system, there is a USB Type-A port that can be found underneath the overarching island, and this resides next to a 12-volt socket and a USB Type-C port that can provide additional power to, let's say, a dashcam. Now, what is a shame, however, is that MG has not integrated navigation data to be fed through to its 7-inch instrument cluster from these third-party mobile operating systems. Indeed, it's something that we actually quite like. So, for example, the VW ID3 or the Cupra Born feed through Android Auto, Apple CarPlay data into the instrument cluster, and therefore allows you to keep your eyes more centered towards the road rather than having to glance at turn-based signals on the main infotainment system. Now, equally, on the MG4 EV, there is no head-up display, be it as an option or indeed as standard in the top spec trim. Now, on the other hand, we do like the pressure sensor that's found in the driver's seat, which effectively powers on the vehicle. And for those who are subscribed, you'll know it's often one of our complaints because it's not too handy in vehicles such as from Tesla, Volvo, or of course from the Volkswagen Group, which effectively power on or power off the vehicle in such behavior. However, in the MG4 EV, when you step in, it powers on, although it's a little bit slow to get going, but when you step out, the vehicle is still on, and therefore you can still utilize the climate controls and the infotainment system for those people who are sat within the cabin and, for example, the driver has just left. Now, for you to power off the vehicle, you'll just simply have to lock it. We do think that's actually a pretty good integration of this sort of start-stop sort of technology, at least when it comes to the pressure sensor within the driver's seat, but do let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Now, similarly, MG has retained physical buttons towards the infotainment system and also on the steering wheel. Yes, we would have still appreciated physical climate controls, but it's nice to see that you can actually press a button on the steering wheel and actually adjust your climate controls on the fly, therefore not having to reside on the somewhat unresponsive touchscreen. Furthermore, the other button can be used to switch between drive modes or the regenerative braking levels, and therefore makes it actually pretty intuitive to use on the move. So aside from all of this, we should have a quick word about its interior design, whereby we like the choice of materials and the stitching work. And yes, it won't compete with more premium offerings from the likes of Volvo or Audi, but in comparison to its competitors such as the VW ID3, the Cupra Born, the Renault Zoe, the Nissan Leaf, or let's say the Vauxhall Corsa E, it is very much on par, or if not in some aspects a little bit better. Now, in terms of its interior design, we should point out that there is no sunroof or indeed panoramic glass roof, an option we like seeing in some of the rival offerings out there on the market, such as, let's say, from the Volkswagen Group. Now, nonetheless, this does actually bring us on to comfort, and here the seats themselves are very accommodating and soft. We've got no problem whatsoever when it comes to doing longer commutes. Now, in this respect, the front seats, the passenger one has got 4-way manual controls, while the driver seat has 6-way manual controls, at least on the SE and the SE long range, but on the Trophy long range, you've got 6-way electronic controls, heated front seats, so both a passenger and driver seat, and also a heated steering wheel. Now, when it comes to headroom and legroom, it's a non-issue at the front of the cabin, no matter how tall or large you are, but at the rear of the cabin, it can be a little bit awkward in terms of the placement of your legs. At least in my opinion, as someone who's just under 6 foot, I can't really stretch out my legs in front because of the positioning of the seats and also the rear portion of the front seat. Thankfully, however, headroom is not too bad. I feel that if I was, let's say, 6'2" to 6'4", I might feel a little bit more hemmed in, but it should be a non-issue, specifically given that MG have kind of curved the top side of the roof. Now, thanks to a omission of a transmission tunnel, it means that the rear outer occupants, if there is of course no rear middle occupants, can pretty much stretch out their legs, and therefore that legroom becomes somewhat of a non-issue. Similarly over here, if you've got a rear middle occupant, they can place their feet flat. Now, it is worth pointing out, however, there is no rear middle headrest. Now, this is absolutely baffling, and I'm not sure how this is actually going to do when it comes to its safety credentials. With no rear middle headrest, it means that anyone that sat in the middle has to be a somewhat short individual, or of course a young child. Now, this does really bring in some safety concerns because all of its competitors offer a rear middle headrest, and we suspect MG have kind of omitted that due to the lack of visibility that you've got at the rear, and therefore bolstered the overall visibility. But still, it would have been nice to see a rear middle headrest, and in our opinion, it's quite baffling not to see it included in this modern age. Now, on that note as well, the rear middle seat does not have any sort of through-loading capabilities and doesn't have any sort of ability to bring down for a armrest or, of course, let's say some cup holders. Now, this does perfectly bring us onto the subject of storage within the cabin. And at the rear, you have got a small little area towards the rear of the center console. You've got these small little bays that are found towards the rear segment of the front seats. And of course, you've got the door compartments, which are a little bit tight. Now, at the front of the cabin, however, it's a lot better. The front door bins will accommodate a 500 milliliter bottle alongside some smaller goods. And then you've got the glove compartment as well. Towards the center console, the armrest compartment will suffice for a small size purse or wallet. Then you've got a little retractable bay which allows you to hide some goods from prying eyes. And then you've got two cup holders, and although they're a little bit awkwardly placed specifically for larger bottles, should suffice for, let's say, a coffee or a tea. Now, as for the floating overarching island, you've then got a wireless charging bay on the Trophy Long Range, or a non-slip area on the SE and the SE Long Range. Better still, if you remove this compartment, you'll find two little holes on either side to filter a USB cable, or of course two USB cables, and then you can pop down that non-slip area and therefore keep it a little bit more tidy towards the front of the cabin. Now, of course, where storage is concerned, we have to talk about its boot capacity. There's a button found just below the MG logo in order to open up the tailgate. It opens up and closes really easily, and it's got that hatchback design, so therefore someone who's just under 6 foot have no problems when it comes to loading in and out goods. However, you might have picked up that despite having the Trophy Long Range, the top spec trim, we do not have an electric tailgate, and it's not available as an option either. Now, when it comes to its capacity, you've got 363 litres, and when the seats are propped down, you've got 1,177 litres. Now, just to put that into perspective, that is on par with the likes of the Hyundai Kona Electric, the SUV. It's a little bit smaller than the VW ID3 or the Cupra Born and the Renault Zoe, and is smaller than the Nissan Leaf or, of course, other SUVs out there on the market, including the ZS EV or, of course, the all-electric estate, the MG4 EV. Nonetheless, its boot capacity should suffice for most consumers, but do let us know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Now, it's worth considering that we have the Trophy Long Range on review that has an adjustable boot floor. This isn't present on the SE or the SE Long Range. Now, why is this of importance? Because, well, it creates a flat loading bay, and if you remember, we do not have any through loading capabilities, and we're limited to 60/40 rear split folding seats. Now, furthermore, this also creates an underfloor compartment storage, which can be handy for taking your charging cables. Now here, the MG4 EV, despite being an electric vehicle that's been built for the ground up, does not have any front storage space, which is offered on some of the rival alternatives. And as a result, means that the underfloor compartment can be actually really handy for taking your charging cables on the go without having to sacrifice any of your boot. So moving swiftly on, we get onto its exterior design, and subjectively we think it looks absolutely stunning. Now, we do think it's taken a few notes from other manufacturers, whereby the front is pretty aggressive and is somewhat reminiscent of a Toyota Supra. Towards the side, a Jaguar I-Pace, and towards the rear, a Kia EV6. All of which are great comparisons to make and very much bolsters the overall design of the MG4 EV. Now, it's worth considering that the 17-inch alloys do come as standard, but they are protected with these aero covers. Again, no complaints because it's very similar to what Tesla do, and it does add to the overall pizzazz of the vehicle. Now, it's worth considering that the Trophy Long Range does have integrated daytime running lights at the front. The tail lights have got this very snazzy design and very eye-catching, at least when you do pay attention to them. And then it's got a two-tone design with a black roof, rear privacy glass, and also these twin aero spoilers that just add to the overall sporty flair of its rear profile. So finally, we get onto its driver assistance systems, and here there's a plethora of them that come built in as standard. although we're not too fond of adaptive cruise control, which does seem to be a little bit jittery, whereby it fails to recognize the speed and the distance of the leading vehicle, meaning that you're getting a little bit of a start-stop sort of feel. Furthermore, the traffic sign recognition system seems to be a little bit off, whereby in 70-mile-an-hour zones or 50-mile-an-hour zones it was picking up 120 and 80, which does seem pretty baffling. Now, aside from this, we do like the lane departure warning and the lane assist, which effectively warn you if you're veering off-piste. Now, they can also be fully disabled via the infotainment system, so that's a certain plus point, and at least at the time of filming and in the UK. Now, aside from these, we have also got high beam assist, driver alert warning, and also emergency brake assist. Now, in the Trophy long range model that we have on review, we also have got blind spot monitoring system, which integrates itself with lane change assist and rear cross traffic alert, all of which are certainly appreciated. So to wrap things up, we should talk about visibility and parking, and here the frontal vision is actually pretty good and therefore makes it very easy to check your surroundings. Spatial awareness shouldn't be a problem for most individuals. Similarly, here when you're going around a bend, or let's say a roundabout, checking your 1 or 2 o'clock, or let's say your 10 or 11 o'clock is very easy because you have got small little cutouts by the windows. Even though you've got pretty chunky A-pillars, it's still pretty easy to peer over towards the side. Now, as for the side view visibility, in other words, let's say for example you don't have the blind spot monitoring system on the Trophy long range and you go for one of the other trim levels, it's still pretty good. They're pretty chunky B-pillars, but again should suffice and not be a problem for most. Now, as for the rear, however, it is pretty limited. The rear view visibility has been kept down to a minimum and therefore can be a little bit hard when it comes to parking. Thankfully, you have front and rear parking sensors, and if you go for the Trophy long range, you will also have 360-degree cameras. But do bear in mind what I mentioned earlier in this review, whereby after initiating the 360-degree cameras for the first time, I wasn't able to actually initiate it again, and therefore meant that I wasn't actually able to benefit from any of the cameras that are positioned around the vehicle. So with all of that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict, and frankly there's very little to dislike about the MG4 EV. Yes, the technology implementation could be better, the driver assistance system's refined, and the fact that the rear middle headrest is missing is somewhat baffling and potentially a safety concern for those people who will be frequently using 3 seats at the back. But it's otherwise an excellent electric vehicle. It's supremely stylish from the exterior, the interior is practical, the boot space and the rear occupancy space should suffice for most consumers. It's very fun to drive thanks to its rear-wheel drive configuration, it goes the distance, and more importantly, is affordable, at least when it comes to fully electric vehicles. As a result of all of this, we can definitely see ourselves wholeheartedly recommending the MG4 EV, and as a result, it actually gets our Best Buy award. Now, I would be curious to know what you make of the vehicle down in the comment section below, and if you think it's potentially MG's best electric vehicle to date. Now, if you've liked this independent detail review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.